Hi there, this is Daniel Cremin, host of Cremin's Corner. And in this episode, this is the second episode of Ask Cremin Anything. I did one last summer and it got a good response. I quite enjoyed doing it. And this was the sort of opportunity for people who sort of engage with me on social media to kind of put questions across that I would sort of agree to answer. So I put out a few questions via, opportunity, a few calls for questions via X and Facebook, and WhatsApp and another group I'm in. And this is what kind of came back. So I'm going to get into these shortly. Just before I do, if do check out the channel more generally after this. And if you're not already subscribed, please do subscribe. Hope you'll share the video as well if you enjoy it. I'm enjoying doing the channel. I don't do it as often as I would love to do, but I'm hoping to change that and be producing more content going forward. But yeah, let's crack on with this. So, first question came from Sam Reform UK on X. He's a good guy. He's asking, how does Reform get to 35% after the sort of the get back to, I suppose, because there were a couple of polls where Reform was up around the 35% mark back in the sort of late summer, early autumn period of 2025. How do they get back to that sort of range of support from where they are at the moment, which is, sort of bobbing around the sort of 26 to 29% sort of mark, generally speaking, in most recent polls? A few, say, like YouGov, who are a bit of an outlier, a little lower. And how does Reform kind of get the political initiative in terms of the national vote intention for Westminster going back up in the right direction? Well, look, you know, the perfect opportunity to kind of galvanise, to put the sort of the wind back in Reform's sails, are these local elections and the devolved elections in Scotland and Wales that are all set for May, for early May. I think it's sort of May the 7th. Reform is very energised right now. They're doing rallies up and down the land, nightly at the moment. Reform has really kind of got the bit between its teeth to kind of utilise these large-scale gatherings to sort of gee up the political energy around their campaign and kind of bring their campaigning message, and sort of attacks against the government and against Conservatives to a broader audience. They're certainly packing people in. I believe they've done 10 venues recently. Nigel Farage was saying sold over 10,000 tickets for them, which is pretty impressive. I think they'll keep trucking away with all of this. I suspect there will be a few more defections of sort of councillors, possibly former parliamentarians in some of the other parties to come. I think there'll be sort of a steady drumbeat of political momentum around some of this leading up to May. And don't forget, after May the 7th, elected representatives in other political parties will not be allowed to join Reform. So, there's a sort of a head of steam building up in that sense. But, beyond the local elections, what does Reform need to do? Well, look, I think one of the things that, Reform needs to think about is the clarity of its position on the economy. What does it stand for? What are its priorities on the economy? I think there are still holdouts amongst the Conservative vote who are worried about what Reform would mean for their pension, whether that's the state pension or their private pension. What does Reform mean in those terms, economically, if it's going for radically different sort of set of economic policies, particularly around energy? What's the sort of disruptive implications of that? So I think there's an element of reassurance to some of those people that needs to be sort of baked into Reform's political messaging going forward. I mean, I recently had a chat with a guy who is natural Tory Reform switcher, really smart guy, and we were just chatting about the kind of political makeup. And this person works in the public sector, and he's Reform minded, but his kind of point was, perhaps Reform is being a little bit overly simplistic with some of its narrative around everybody needs to be in constantly, working in the office environment. He wasn't saying he wasn't open to doing that himself. He was saying, actually, if you look at recent years, actually a lot of the government buildings around the country have been sort of sold off Where are you going to put the civil servants that you do want to retain? How, thinking about the mechanics, the practicalities of government. I think to those sort of people, they need to hear more than slogans. They need to hear more of the substance that's going to reassure them that reform is ready to govern. And I think we need to sort of fast track the development of solid policies in some of the areas that are of real importance to us. I think people need to know, broadly speaking, what Reform's energy strategy looks like, where in the country it's going to be focusing any new nuclear developments on, who, the kind of the private sector partners they're kind of considering in this era, who they're talking to, what the plans are around large scale infrastructure development as well. Reform has been talking about a national sovereign wealth fund, using the local pension scheme. What's that actually going to pay for? How is that going to be beneficial to both to the people whose pensions are at stake, but also to the country at large? What does an economic strategy for reform look like? So I think starting to answer some of those questions will help to bring reform up over the 30%, towards the 35% mark. And I think on culture as well, I think it's just about having a disciplined message around migration and integration. I think reform just needs to kind of not swim too much to the wilder shores. It needs to have credible sort of policies and not be kind of going down a populist pathway with loose rhetoric and so forth. We need to reassure our target electoral coalition that we're taking migration seriously, but at the same time not overpromise and not say things that are potentially unsavoury, that aren't going to go down that well with parts of our electoral coalition. So yeah, that would be my answer to that. Another question here. Do I think there is a path back into politics for Boris Johnson into power, or at least frontline national politics with the Conservative Party? Well, into power, I don't think so, because I just think the Conservatives at this point in time are in a really, really bad state, and I'm not convinced that anything's going to turn it round. I think Boris himself brings a lot of baggage. I think there are still even on my own timeline on X, and I come across people who, some of whom are supporting reform, who still have a lot of time for Boris. But I also come across a lot of people who cannot stand him, who were fervent, and I remember this, fervent Boris supporters sort of back in 2016 and back in 2019. Boris lost a lot of support because of the pandemic, because of his pandemic management approach, the lockdowns, the whole new normalism kind of agenda, the net zero agenda as well, and just that sense that money was flying around for priorities. The levelling up, sort of pork barreling, some people felt it was that he wasn't a serious figure in government, leading a responsible party of government. So he brings a lot of baggage, and I just think that a lot of the people who are still hanging on in the Conservatives, in and around the power centre, I don't think they're keen to see him come back in any real way, shape, or form. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about Boris Johnson in the past, and how the reception that he would get. So I don't hold myself up here as saying absolute fount of knowledge and he has no chance of ever coming back. Strange things have happened, but I just don't see him getting into power, into government again. And I certainly don't think that if in the event that reform fell short of a majority, that they would want to work with Boris Johnson, having him in a cabinet, around the cabinet table. I just think it would be a non-starter for a lot of reformers, who got elected. Could he get back into the Conservative Party, into Parliament, either as a peer, possibly more likely as a peer, or as an MP? With the thing of coming back in through a by-election, it's quite a risk for him, because Reform would throw everything they've got to stop him. You could stand at the next general election again, though. Is that necessarily in the interest of either Kemi Badenoch or James Cleverly, whoever's leading the Conservative Party at that point in time? I'm just not sure that he'd be able to get selected, frankly, because I think CCHQ might not be that keen to allow him to be. And that in of itself could set the the pigeons flying. I'm trying to think of a metaphor there for it. They're the cat amongst the pigeons. That's it. If Boris did try to come back and all hell broke loose because of CCHQ blocking, so yeah, watch this space. Something could happen, but heart of hearts, I think he's done in UK politics. I think he enjoys stirring the pot, but I think he's made quite a bit of money on the lecture circuit and from his book. I mean, I'm sure he's got plans in the future to write more. I just don't necessarily think this idea of this cod Churchill figure where he's going to come riding back in a bit like how Churchill didn't lose power, of course, in the sense of leaving Parliament like Boris slunk off. Churchill actually stayed and led the opposition and went on to win in 1951 after losing the year before a general election. There was another general election brought about, and he won that. It wasn't a particularly successful period for him afterwards, and he ended up adopting a lot of policies he said he was going to get rid of. But Churchill persevered. Boris kind of ran away before he could be booted out. I'm just not sure he's going to come back. I know he sees himself as a kind of Churchillian figure, but ultimately, I think he's a wise guy in his own way. I think he can read the political rooms. I think he knows he's done. But that's just my take anyway. I could be wrong, and I hope I'm not, but I could be wrong. Okay, another question. This was about Shabana Mahmood and the immigration reforms and the potential for her latest set of immigration reforms. This was a question about will she resign or will she just lump it if the Labour MPs unpick her migration reforms in the way that Rachel Reeves's earlier plans for benefit reform were kind of sived away by the Labour backbenchers. So look, what's happening here is there was a recent sort of slate of policies announced a couple of months ago now, I think, a few months back anyway, by Shabana Mahmood, the Labour Home Secretary. These were sort of a doubling of the requirement for most people, the waiting time to get indefinite leave to remain, including for existing holders, from 5 to 10 years in most cases, and on a sliding scale of 15 to 20 years for certain visa categories. So if you came on a social care work visa or an NHS work visa for some of those kind of lower skilled job support roles, you might be waiting 15 years once you get the ILR. And if you came as a refugee, potentially up to 20 years before you qualify for British citizenship. And also kind of going with that, they were also talking about new restrictions on access to social housing for anybody who's claiming asylum who's been convicted of a crime, either in the UK or in the past. So limitations, things to kind of disincentivize the pull factor to want to come to the UK. And, permanent bans for certain people who commit crimes on ever being able to get a successfully granted asylum application. So there were a range of policies that were sort of being announced by Shabana. Now, look, Stella Creasy, who's become this sort of central figure of the sort of the middle class kind of liberal contingent of reform, the progressive soft left wing of not reform, of the Labour Party. Sorry, I've got reform on the brain sometimes. Of the Labour Party, she was of course famous for pushing the abortion amendment, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later, to the recent policing and crime bill that's very contentious. But she's also been leading the charge on this. And it's apparently the case that there's up to 60 Labour MPs already sort of signing letters and sort of organising to say that they're going to vote against the government on this legislation when it comes forward to do with Shabana's kind of reforms. Do I think Shabana would resign over this? No, absolutely not. I think Shabana is very ambitious and very comfortable in her role as she is. I do not see her resigning on a matter of principle over this, particularly because I just don't think it would play well internally with the Labour membership for her to do so. And she does have designs on the Labour leadership when that becomes available, by all accounts. So no, I don't think she would resign. I think Labour has kind of got used to U-turning. It's made so many U-turns now that I think she would just kind of chalk it up to, par for the course with Keir Starmer and sort of shift the blame through briefing on to number 10 losing its nerve rather than herself. So I think Shabana would stay. Do I think those reforms will all happen? I think that you can have to look at the fine print, and I imagine that they'll end up with a more of a sliding scale of the on the ILR reforms that actually bring more people closer to a sort of 10-year mark. They might end up not going for 10 years, going for something like 8 years, some sort of fillip to the backbenchers to kind of buy them off. But I think they'll get something through, but it probably will be watered down a bit. Coming on to another question. This was by Big Fan of My Kids, who's on X, who's another really great, prolific sort of pro-reform tweeter and really good thinker on politics. And she was asking, about the role of the king in relation to royal assent, in relation to this recent amendment to the police and crime bill. This was introduced by by Stella Creasy in the House of Commons, and it went through to the Lords after having passed in the Commons. The Lords did try to strip it out, but there weren't enough of them there, so it's passed. And this was a question about, will this act get royal assent? What's the role of the king in this? Could he step in and stop it? And let me just be clear about the substance of this. So what this Stella Creasy amendment, what this did to the government's bill, and it was overwhelmingly supported in the Commons, by the way, by Labour MPs, this would decriminalise women performing self-abortion at late stage of a pregnancy. This would decriminalise the present prospect of a criminal prosecution for the women who arrange, an abortion either with a medical assistance or doing it themselves, which is a pretty horrendous thing for a late-term baby. At present, there's no plan to change the 24-week legal period for what the NHS and other private providers can officially do to support it. And technically, if a clinician was performing it after those 24 weeks, they could be criminally prosecuted, but the woman who had the abortion would not be. Now, this is a very controversial change, and it's really upset people because, of course, what we're talking about in some cases is, potentially up to I think sort of the day of birth, the day before birth, the idea that you could perform a late stage abortion on a fully grown, fully developed fetus on a baby, it's, pretty extreme, a lot of people would feel. It's a contentious issue. It passed. There was no electoral mandate from the public. This wasn't something people were screaming and shouting for. I don't believe. I don't think it was. Something. I think it's something that, largely speaking, has passed the public by. It's kind of been smothered by the legacy media. Not the public are not that aware of this policy in the way that they are aware of the assisted dying debates that have been going on for that legislation. That did kind of get into the public consciousness slowly but surely. This didn't. Look, the role of the king. Now, look, constitutionally, we have this funny system in Britain whereby we have an uncodified constitution resulting from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent legislation in 1689, and from then on, that sort of effectively formalised the concept of the crown in Parliament, of the crown of the kingdom, the political sovereignty of the king being concentrated in the hands of his ministers, who are formed through an elected parliamentary government. They're formed from the will of the parliament, from as a representative body. Parliamentary government has responsibility for the laws of the land. They're still the king's laws, and the king has to provide royal assent to those laws. But in practice, we are a constitutional monarchy whereby the role of the king is to take the advice of his ministers and privy councillors on the legislation that is presented to him and pass it. And that's the stasis of the law. That's effectively what it says. Now, look, there is nothing. That's the custom, the convention, I should say. It's not all written down in law. This is the funny thing about the British Constitution. It's a convention. It's a long-standing approach that royal assent is provided, and that's how the law becomes the law. but there is no obligation technically on the king to give royal assent. And the kings, in the past, kings and queens have very occasionally rejected legislation on the advice of their ministers in extreme situations where they felt there were new developments that meant actually that law should be set aside before it gets onto the statute books because there'd been further developments. That's happened once or twice. I think it was Queen Anne was the last time it happened, and that was a very long time ago. But technically the king would not be breaking the constitution if he was to refuse to put the legislation. Nothing legally he would be doing there would be wrong. However, politically it would be dynamite, and it would probably put the monarchy into serious danger. It would lead to demands for a referendum on the future of the monarchy. I expect the cat would be amongst the pigeons amongst the Labour MPs. A lot of Republicans would come out of the woodwork. So, realistically, I think the king will give royal assent to this. But it was really interesting watching on my timeline the reaction of a lot of conservatives and reformers who are generally pro the monarchy to this particular piece of legislation. And this view as well of that he's the defender of the faith, that he's meant to be the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Um, that element of his role as a king, how that balanced with this constitutional monarchy concept. It was really interesting to see the degree of ire towards the government, but also towards the monarchy if they let this happen. And it's worrying as somebody who's a monarchist that, at the moment there is just this sense that, people don't necessarily feel that well represented by the king because of some of the priorities that he sort of places, on net zero and on social justice and a very particular kind of globalist sort of view of, poverty and international development and climate change, all of these kind of issues, where he's not really in keeping with the segment of the population that's probably traditionally the most the most royalist, most pro-monarchy. There's kind of an alarming gulf beginning to kind of open up there that I do worry about. I mean, constitutionally, it's absolutely proper that he will follow the advice of his ministers and give assent to this bill. And it will become the law of the land, unfortunately. And, we'll have to wait a few years for reform to do something about that if they get in. But, it worries me that there is this steady head of steam building on the right to ask bigger questions about the monarchy. Because I want to see the monarchy continue and I want to see it be successful. But, a lot of people are saying, well, if it's not going to be a bulwark on things that we feel are fundamentally important and are fundamentally moral issues, what's it actually for? And that's a dangerous question for the monarchy. And it's an invidious, it's a pretty bad position that the government of the day is kind of putting the monarch in with that piece of legislation. So that's probably all I'm going to say on that particular topic. Oh, and then just a final question from big fan of my kids on Angela Rayner's manoeuvres, what she's up to. And she's certainly up to a few things. So she's writing a book. Not sure she's writing it herself or if somebody ghostwriting it for her. And she's had her advance for that she's going to use to probably pay back her fine. And she's also out apparently doing lots of, paid talks to bankers and so forth. And one of these paid talks recently set the markets astir because she was agreeing fulsomely with Andy Burnham's comments that we don't need to worry too much about the gilt markets, that Labour is overspooked by how the markets will react to fiscal events, and that Labour needs to be bolder in its plans for, national renewal through, large-scale infrastructure and social spending and an industrial strategy, just start printing money effectively and going for it. And of course, this didn't go down particularly well with the markets. And, we're already at a time where Labour's sort of fiscal credibility is in tatters because, the growth plan is non-existent, as Wes Streeting might say in his text to Peter Mandelson. The growth plan is non-existent. They're missing their targets on GDP growth. Unemployment is continuing, unfortunately, to rise, and particularly youth unemployment. Business formation is slowing. as I understand it, and productivity, particularly public sector productivity, is terrible. So with all of this sort of backdrop, public finances are strained as it is, and then you've kind of got characters like Angela Rayner sort of running around and sort of beating the drum for even more public spending at a time of low growth. Look, to me, it's not a serious. She's not a serious political figure. She's always been calamitous. She's always been very much. She's the epitome of how unserious a lot of Westminster has become. How unserious Labour has become. Unfortunately, I mean, 20 odd years ago, I was a member of the Labour Party. People like Angela Rayner were very much on the fringes back then. Now they're the mainstream. Now they're the sort of the powerful figures in Labour. I mean, back then I was sort of a young, very young character in there. I was a sort of a Blairite, a third wayer, more of a liberal really than a social democrat. But there were a lot of quite sensible people in and around the mix at that point in time. Most of them have long since left, and Labour has kind of lurched to the left. Angela Rayner, is the epitome of that sort of lower calibre of Labour MP that sort of displaced some of the old right of the Labour Party, some of those older Social Democrats who had worked actually in the trade, not just been trade union employees in London, they'd actually been trade union representatives in their industries. A lot of those people have retired. Labour is very different. It's very much the party of the third sector and the public sector now. It's different. And Angela Rayner is definitely on manoeuvres. She wants to make her big comeback. She is being increasingly disloyal to Keir Starmer. She feels she has very little to lose. She's made a few public interventions, have been quite critical of the government in Parliament and in the media. I think she's building her machine up to have a challenge. I just sense that the public have had their fill of her, and I think even Labour members might look at this and think, maybe your time has passed. Maybe you had your shot and you blew it because of your second home, your purchase and all of that, and you look hypocritical. I'm hoping that's the case because I think psychologically, I just don't think the country could stomach the idea. A lot of us could not stomach the idea of Angela Rayner becoming the Prime Minister. I think it would lead to a real brain drain. I think it would lead to an exodus of a lot of talented people if she made it. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen. There are other sort of more viable, sensible people on the Labour side who could do a better job as Prime Minister. Shabana Mahmood or Wes Streeting are just two good examples of that. You'd have to hope that either of them might be a challenger. My definite fear, though, actually is less Angela Rayner. It's more the prospect of Ed Miliband somehow getting in. And we know how ambitious he is from what he did to his own brother back in 2010. Ed is off the charts in terms of that political ruthlessness. And I could see him going for the leadership and trying to destabilise Keir Starmer. So that's where things are with the Labour Party. What other questions do I have? I'm being asked about what's going on with reform's sort of preparations for power. So this is the preparedness for government sort of agenda. And they're talking about what are the priorities. Is the other question sort of baked into this is what are the sort of the key priorities, the governing priorities of the Reform Shadow Cabinet now? The first tranche of it's been formed. So this was when Nigel Farage announced, 4 of the portfolios. Robert Jenrick as Shadow Chancellor, Richard Tice would be Deputy Prime Minister, but also the Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy, and Trade. And he'd also have housing baked into that agenda as well, being the lead on housing. Suella Braverman to take on the education portfolio as well. And I think there's a fourth one, but I'll come back to it. I'm just trying. My brain is rotting. Oh yes, of course, I know who I'm talking about. Zia Youssef as Shadow Home Secretary, which is a really good appointment. But yeah, those are the first sort of 4 announcements, and then this whole thing of there was a sort of also shake up internally in reform with Zia vacating the head of policy role to take that position on, and a guy called James Orr who'd been working under him and as a national advisor to Nigel Farage in recent months, becoming formally the head of policy and continuing to work with a very close ally of his, Danny Kruger MP, who is the MP for East Wiltshire, another conservative, former conservative who came over to reform. He came over, I think, back in October, November time, and he's leading the preparedness for government unit. So look, what's happening there? I mean, I'm not privy to absolutely everything going on, but from what I'm sort of picking up, they are beefing up the size of the policy team there, both the central sort of policy team and that specific unit focused on preparedness for government, looking at the sort of the mechanisms and the personnel they're going to need and the systems planning. They are making some hires. One notable hire they've made is a guy called Sam Ashworth Hayes, who's a Telegraph lead writer. He's quite a prominent sort of figure on the right, centre right, quite a thoughtful guy. He's coming in. And I think inevitably there's got to be a bit of churn, kind of as James brings in his own people to sort of shake things up there. But yeah, there's lots happening in and around there in terms of what's kind of emerging as the sort of the priorities and the themes for how they're going to sort of approach the issue of governing. Well, the first thing I would say is the continued emphasis on Whitehall reform, on a slimmed down civil service, and a civil service that's incentivised to focus on delivering what ministers tell them to do. Less ministers do what they tell them to do, more the other way around. Kruger is a critic of the kind of the opaqueness and the dysfunctionality of the Cabinet Office, which is this really quite important structure that passes a lot of people by how much power. It's kind of the coordinating hub, the central junction of the government, and it holds a lot of stuff up, and it has quite a lot of power to kind of, alongside the Treasury, to really kind of, Treasury holds the purse strings, but the Cabinet Office kind of holds the papers, as it were. It's kind of, you don't really get anywhere if you don't have the Cabinet Office blessing at the moment to kind of achieve your goals. They control the Cabinet Committee system and so forth. A lot flows through it. So he wants to slim down and professionalise the Cabinet Office structure and bring in more external political appointees if reform get in. He wants to look at payment by results for some of the quangos. He wants to look at bringing in more external domain experts, some on short-term contracts, who are there to deliver very specific projects for the government. Bringing in tech sector experts to look at government and how it handles data, how it can extract more value from the data that it holds, all of these kind of approaches. So yeah, there's lots kind of bubbling up. I would say the governing priorities, what they're focusing on at the moment, is trying to get legislation ready in some of the key areas for what they want to achieve. So, Zia's already talked about they've got, the legislation that they need for leaving the ECHR and any other international treaties ready to go. And they've also got legislation on the blocks for the deportation command structure for dealing with illegal migrants who are already in the UK, for how they're going to find them and rapidly deport them without interference from the judges. Getting all of that aligned, that's already in the works. There are pieces of legislation being developed around what a national sovereign wealth fund would look like, some of their energy infrastructure priorities. So, getting rid of the Climate Change Act 2008, largely speaking, and allowing new oil and gas licenses and new nuclear power to go ahead, looking at how you would fast track those kind of applications, how you would deregulate the nuclear kind of regime to make it much more affordable to build new nuclear at scale in the way that other countries like South Korea are able to do. So there's lots of sort of change happening there. I do think things are moving forward, but we're still quite a ways away potentially from the general election, and we shouldn't expect all the policies to be out in the public domain too quickly. But yeah, I think there's a sort of a definite focus on a high performance culture within the civil service as well, trying to build that. What would that look like? That's an area of focus for sure. So yeah, I think that probably wraps it up for now. Oh, wait, one more. Sorry, one more. I was asked by an old friend of mine, Tim, who I knew in my Labour days, about my own political journey and how I ended up in Reform UK. So he knew me in my sort of new Labour days, I should say. That's probably the right way to say it. So when I was kind of young, I was, from a left of centre familial background. Parents both sort of left of centre voters. I wasn't particularly left wing even at university, to be honest. I was quite centrist, quite politically and economically almost liberal. Even then, always in favour of market economics, but kind of probably social market economy thinking. I was a sort of third wayer back then. And I was quite impressed with Tony Blair during his sort of second and early third term. That's when I was sort of in the Labour Party. But I felt after 2007, after he was pushed out by Labour and they got Gordon Brown in, Labour kind of reverted to type, and I drifted away from them. My own job back then, and for many years after, was sort of working in public affairs, and I had to engage a lot with Labour and Conservatives. And I found myself increasingly impressed at the time by people like Michael Gove, Nick Gibb, some of the other sort of Conservative shadow ministers, and some of the teams that they were building around them. So I gravitated inevitably towards the Conservatives because I was already, once you're working, once you're out of university and you're starting to feel how much tax take is there, how much needless regulation there is in our lives, I was already moving to the right. But yeah, doing public affairs, it took me into the orbit of the Conservative Party, and I ended up joining around sort of just after the 2010 election, really. Joined the Conservatives, not because I thought, oh, they're the winning team. They hadn't won a majority. They'd kind of got in by the skin of their teeth through a coalition with the Lib Dems. But I was kind of relieved that Gordon Brown hadn't got back in. I felt we were on the wrong track as a country under him. And I decided to give the Conservatives a chance, and I joined them. And the weird thing I found quickly is I found myself being to the right on social and economic issues to quite a lot of Conservatives. And I started to realise, actually, I'm probably more conservative than I am classically liberal in some respects as well over time. I mean, my politics is a kind of fusion of classical liberalism, sort of borrowing from the sort of the John Locke, the David Hume, sort of Adam Smith kind of view of society and the importance of property, but also blending that with a sort of Burkean ordered liberty concept. An organic development of society. My politics is kind of a fusion of both. And I found myself, I particularly was inspired by Margaret Thatcher's, her record in government, really did impress me, but also her thinking, her philosophical outlook on society and on the importance of freedom. I took great solace from that, particularly after 2017 when the Conservatives lost their majority. I sort of found myself increasingly looking back and taking inspiration from that more economically liberal, smaller state view of what conservatism should be. And yeah, I felt myself very disappointed in the Boris era by his governing priorities and that sort of boosterism and net zero and the new normalism of the pandemic and all this emphasis on sort of Rooseveltian conservatism was a nonsense. It was just big state, nanny state politics. I found myself increasingly being on the reform wavelength even before the 2024 election, and I moved over just before polling day because I was just increasingly impressed by what Richard Tice and Nigel Farage were talking about. I was really pleased to vote for them and endorse them. So that's my political journey in essence. You have kids, you get on the housing ladder, you realise that a lot of the problems in life are actually caused not by an absence of government, but by an excess of government. And that's what we need to change in this country. We need to kind of get back to a social compact that puts more emphasis on the importance of our individuality and of our choices, that balances our freedoms with responsibility and an expectation of self-reliance, but also ensures that the state gets the fundamentals right. The state should do a lot less overall, but what it should be focusing on is doing what it needs to do really well, getting it right the first time, getting the fundamentals right, so that we actually have a really prosperous and successful future as a society, as a civilization. And at the moment, we're on the wrong pathway. So that's my take anyway. I hope you've enjoyed this second edition of Ask Cremin Anything. It was a good fun to do. Yeah, and I'll probably do another one, hopefully not too distant future, and some more episodes generally. Do let me know in the comments what you think, and any other questions you've got for the future. That would be great. Thank you very much. Bye bye.